Yeah, we talk about like physical fitness and how that's inseparable from like realization fitness and everything. In this episode, I was interviewed by Buddhist teacher from Sri Lanka, Dr. Vipula, connecting ancient teachings to the modern life and practice. Why views are consequential and why one should always start and end with the right view. Why there are no such things as thoughts ultimately, the trap of no mind going beyond the one and the many. The pedagogical problems amongst online Dharma communities. Why I renounced from females in relationships for a whole year. Reflections on money and duty. Flipping the karma off and the joy of working in a 9 to 5 and making professional and adequate gains. The inseparability between ultimate and relative truths. Work and play. Physical and realization fitness. Life and mind training. Contemplative fitness as a lifestyle. How to measure spiritual progress the same way you measure physical progress. How instead of meditation techniques, one should think in terms of maneuvers and routings. How to not confuse experiences with insights, insights with realizations. The inconceivable depths and the multifaceted jewels of realization. And footage from the Contemplative CrossFit Mentors Retreat. My mom's Jewish boyfriend's mom's 100th birthday. Happy. And having been measured against coworkers who are highly realized, and how do you relate with the Buddha?
Frank Yang
Yes,
is our guest today, and I hope I pronounced your name right. So Frank, welcome to this channel. I mean, I'm so honored and privileged to have you on board.
Thank you.
Let me give you a small background as to what we are expecting from you. Sri Lankans are primarily Buddhist and they are Theravada Buddhists. But in the last 10 years or so, they are beginning to realize there are other speakers, whether they are from non-dual field or whether they are from individual fields, they are speaking the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
This discussion will help because I have watched some of your videos and I found that your versions are very, very pragmatic and the people can actually turn attention to themselves and ask themselves the question, who am I and what I am? So here is the first question. Our experience derives from what you see, what you hear, what you think, and what you feel. And these are the basic experience. Whatever that emanates from that, whether it's your life story or your biodata or your position. So should we be paying more attention to the thoughts because that's the biggest challenge.
Right. Ultimately, thoughts are just sensations too, right? We have the aggregates in the sense stores. So thoughts, feelings, sight, sound, whatever the case is. I guess you can reduce them down to sensations, but ultimately the sensations are also empty and they're not apart from the nature of mind, from the groundless ground, the unconditioned. So it depends on the person's disposition or, their background, what they prefer. So there are different ways to go about it, right? Some traditions like Dzogchen, even though they do a lot of like preliminary practices, eventually the path is the fruit, right? It's like you just recognize the nature of mind and then you recognize it again and then again and again. You be pointed out to the nature of mind and you recognize it again and again and again. But then for, I guess, Theravadins, at least the way I did Vipassana, which is, grounded in Theravada tradition, we don't go into the nature of mind, at least not yet, at least not the first retreat that we go to. We just focus on maybe the nature of the conditions themselves, like, seeing the impermanence of sensations coming and going, seeing that there is no self apart from this flow, and then see that there is no permanent or solidified entity in the midst of those sensations. But even that is just an expedient means of recognizing the unconditioned ultimately, because even impermanence is not an ultimate insight, right? Because like the reason why there is impermanence is because you still have a reference point, say the observer that's observing what's impermanent. So then you go a little deeper, sure, that's an insight, but it's not a realization. I find that people can really confuse experience with insight, and they confuse insights with realization. But what is it to be realized, right? This unborn, unconditioned nature of mind, which is not independent or apart from any states or experiences, but is not dependent of a state or of any experiences either. You go a little deeper, you say, oh, the observer is actually just part of the flow too. So the subject-object collapse. So what's permanently observing the impermanence, what's being observed, and the observer, they collapse onto themselves, onto each other. They cancel each other out. So you go beyond even that duality between permanence and impermanence. and you enter this unconditional flow where it doesn't matter if you're flowing or not flowing, right? It's the unconditioned, which is beyond coming and going, the nature of mind, which is, again, it's not apart from the flowing of sensations and the conditionalities and the aggregates, but also at the same time, no conditionalities and no aggregates can touch it. And this is where you get into the neither the same nor different territory, right? Or neither one nor the many, which is the collapsing of the two truths, the ultimate and the relative. And all of your questions, like people ask me in regards to like, oh, sudden versus gradual path, or like surrendering or letting everything be as it is, or letting go, versus exertion and or concentration in the doing, would collapse with this realization. So if the unconditioned is exactly the same as the conditioned, then there's nothing to realize, right? And people go around saying, oh, yeah, I'm already the Buddha. Ultimately, it's not wrong to say that, but people like to explain the relative away with the ultimate. So with this view, it's easy to just bypass by saying things again like, oh, nirvana is the same as samsara when you're still in samsara, right? If the unconditioned, on the other hand, is totally different from the conditioned, then there will be a danger in reifying the ultimate or God, or the unconditioned is like all the way over there, or something that's behind the curtain of appearances, creating the split between the divine and the mundane. So neither the extreme view of everything is the same or the extreme view of everything is different, neither lead to liberation. If this sounds confusing, it's because you cannot grasp this with the conventional logic. This is why enhancing your yogic intellect by studying works of like Nagarjuna would really help with refining your views, because you really gotta sort out these non-dual dialectics. At the same time, this non-dual logic can be studied prematurely and would not even make sense unless you have some yogic capacities or experiences. So you need to both practice in meditation and studying. The three pillars of our practice, view, refinement, absorption, and purification, they all go hand in hand. They reinforce each other in a reciprocal feedback loop. So thoughts are not special. If you look at the 5 aggregates model, thoughts is not even an aggregate, which means that ultimately speaking, there is no such thing as thoughts. Thoughts are the codependent rising process between mainly the form and the fabrication aggregate. But of course, all 5 aggregates, form, feeling, perception, consciousness, and fabrication, they are all interdependent. And none of the aggregates have an inherent existence apart from their relationships to each other.
Thought comes in, it stirs the sensation, then it leads to a feeling. It may or may not be leading to an action.
Right, yeah.
If you isolate the thought which comes and creates the sensation, at one point do you arrest that?
Oh, I see what you mean. You're asking at what point do I let go of my focus on examining thoughts?
What's on your mind? Nothing.
The reason why we focus so much on thoughts is because as modern humans, we're constantly ruminating, right? Like our society requires us to constantly think thoughts. Right, so that's the reason why thoughts are special in a lot of the spiritual practices. But again, like I said earlier, thoughts are not really special, right? They're just sensations too. But then you can really fall into the trap of reifying the state of no self if you, at the same time, putting the thoughts in a pedestal while simultaneously trying to get rid of it. By trying to get rid of thoughts, you're actually reifying it. So the state of having no thoughts is just a temporary state, right? It's not the ultimate truth. But then we need that as an anchor or a ground in order to further progress our spiritual path, because most of us are bombarded with thoughts all the time. We don't have the stillness to even recognize deeper insights, like the nature of compounding phenomena. It's exactly what you just said. How thoughts lead to feelings, and it leads to like the way you react, and then your actions and habitual tendencies and the becomings and all that stuff, which then loops back to create an ongoing loop of catch-22, right? That's the cycle of samsara, like the 12 links of dependent origination, if you want to break it down like that. So we cannot even be able to see those or recognize these patterns unless our minds are collected, and at least to a point where you don't have to be completely silent, but at least still enough to be able to recognize these patterns at a subtle and subtle level.
When a thought is being watched, you can see it disappears.
Yeah,
And this is something that you can practice. But the point is, it doesn't solve the problem.
It doesn't solve the problem.
Keeps coming.
Yeah, it's a temporary ground, right? So I think a lot of times we mistaken the remedy or the method for truth, or we mistaken the means for an end. So you see a lot of like radical non-dual circles out there. They would say something like thoughts are just bad, or like concepts are just bad. Like the ultimate state is to be in a state with no thoughts. So they're kind of they're trying to explain it away, right? Like you said, it's not possible to have no thoughts, right? Thoughts just come in just like the way birds fly, right? The birds chirp and the clouds pass by. It doesn't matter. Like once you recognize the nature of thoughts or the nature of phenomena as empty of self or essence, it doesn't matter if you have thoughts or not. You can actually think without thoughts. You can actually have a million thoughts and still not be disturbed because there's no thinker. That you realize the thinker is just another thought, which also simultaneously gives you more flexibility to utilize concepts or to, generate thoughts in a way that's useful and pragmatic. So thoughts are not the enemy.
When you said the thoughts are not permanent, you also need the thoughts to say that there is no thinker. Isn't that a good position, to start this journey?
At first, you realize that there's no thinker. The thinker is just another thought, and then you realize that you can actually think without thinking. You can tell someone there's no thinker, but they don't even have the stability of the mind to see that insight. So, sure, you can inseminate their mind with this insight at the intellectual level, and then allow them to do investigations, allow them to slowly let that insight seep in. But that might presuppose some kind of a preliminary practice, like watching your thoughts from the position of an observer, and then see that the observer is actually just another thought or just another cluster of sensation that is not ultimately doing the observation, right? We're just pretending to look at a thought from the perspective of an observer, but actually that's not what's happening, right? Because every sensation is actually aware of themselves. Every sensation is sensing themselves exactly where they are. It doesn't take an observer or a reference point or the apprehender.
If you can at least give us a clue as to how your journey began.
I think my journey with spirituality or meditation started it's hard to pinpoint exactly where it started. Like you said, even when I started playing the violin at the age of 5, when I started making art, like even before I could speak, in a sense, my journey already started. Right. In a sense, my journey started the moment that I was incarnated, or even before, if you believe in reincarnation. At the more like conventional level, 27, 28, that's when I started to meditate, like formally sit. Like before that, for a few years, I was experimenting with philosophy. But then that was just an ongoing trajectory of this whole life, this whole path. I see no distinction between the path and life and mind, right? And I started doing TM, like transcendental meditation. And after that, I did my first Vipassana retreat. And then after my first Vipassana retreat, I just got really serious with meditation. I was sitting up to like 2 hours a day minimum for the next few years, maybe the next like 5 years. Yeah, and then I went on my second Vipassana retreat, and that was when I just experienced all the jhanas and had my first like cessation, I guess you can call it that. But that was before I even read about anything like that, But then I had to discover that. I learned all of that myself. After having these experiences, after my second retreat, I went online and just did some research, and I discovered that there's a lot of people online. Oh, well, back then there wasn't a lot of people yet, but there were still communities of people talking about these kind of, jhanic states, absorptions and things like that on the internet. That's when I discovered the Pragmatic Dharma Circle. Guys like Daniel Ingram or like Kenneth Folk or like Shijin Yang, Chiladosa, people like that. And then I venture out to the more radical non-dualist. One video leads to another. And I discovered like Adyashanti, Rupert Spiral. I never resonated too much with the very extreme radical non-dualists. There's something just off about it. I don't know. Maybe because of my background in Vipassana, I always practice, right? But for them, it's like, yeah, you don't need to practice. There's nobody here to practice. I mean, like I said, like, ultimately, that's not wrong, right? But then a lot of the non-dual teachers, the radical ones, they have a point. But then the problem is that they will explain everything away through their ultimate, through the lens of the ultimate. But then if you haven't bridged the gap between the relative and the ultimate, then you can't take that in. You can't understand that insight at all. You can only understand it through your own self view, through your own relative lens. And that's why a lot of people, they just bypass and they just suppress, bypass, whatever the case is. And they just got a bunch of people watching non-dual videos and they're like, oh, there's nothing to do here. But then they're still suffering. They just like use that as a mantra to like look cool or like to almost like feeding onto their identity. It's like, oh yeah, there's no identity here. There's no one here. But then who's saying that? Do you actually realize that at the experiential level, at the embodied level? That the insight is beyond all extremes, beyond all dualities. So like no self is actually just another extreme. Self and no self is an extreme. Happy birthday to even non-duality ceases to be a thing because non-duality can only exist in relative to dualities. When I look out into the world, I don't see non-duality, neither do I see duality.
This radical non-dual version is that there is no one here,
Yeah.
no self. There's no one doing this. This is what is happening. This is what is. However, the ones who are advocating, like Rupert Spira or even Muji for that matter, they speak about oneness, interconnectedness. Now, that interconnectedness somehow resonates with a lot of people because one can't be here without the other.
Yeah.
Everything is linked. Would you favor more this oneness concept than, this no self?
I think oneness, like everything's one mind, is not exactly the same insight as how everything's interconnected, right? That's the insight into dependent origination. And dependent origination, I think, is a quote unquote deeper insight because if you truly understand how everything is interconnected, how everything is codependent arising, you see that oneness is codependent arising with separateness. So you go beyond the one and the many, clinging on to neither. So you can say it's neither one nor the many, but even that in itself could be a view, right? Nagarjuna, there's four extremes, right? Four extreme views that you must go beyond. Number one is attachment to existence. Number two is attachment to non-existence. Three, both existence and non-existence. Four, neither existence nor non-existence. So people who cling on to the oneness view usually skews towards craving for existence, the view of eternalism. On the other side of that extreme is annihilism, constantly trying to annihilate everything. And if you cling on to that view, you can end up become nihilistic, which is the same view as eternalism if you think about it, just opposite sides of the same extreme, right? And if you cling on to eternalism, you're constantly trying to expand consciousness. And on the other side of that extreme, you're just constantly trying to get rid of the self, endlessly trying to dissolve conditioning. But what are you using to untie this knot over here? Isn't it just by creating another knot over there? And if you're constantly trying to expand, then doesn't that presuppose that there is some resistance or some contractions that you're trying to get away from? There's still a reference point. All views have to be self-invalidated. You invalidate even the process of invalidation. That's why even the insight of, say, dependent origination and emptiness have to be invalidated. Otherwise, you just end up rareifying emptiness, right? Making it into a something. To rarefy means to make something substantial or solid, some kind of ultimate ground that the self is clinging onto for identification. And let's be honest, unless you are a Buddha, you're holding on to an extreme view, no matter how subtle it is. People get cling on to the process of trying to constantly self-invalidate everything too, right? If you truly realize that even emptiness is empty, everything becomes full. So you can say the nature of mind is the viewless view, the ultimate liberating view. But it's so easy to turn that into just another view, right? This view refinement thing is so important. You begin with the right view, you end with the right view. Because if you don't have the right view, you can be practicing for decades, and no matter what techniques or methods that you use, you could just be wasting your time because you're still reinforcing that view you're not seeing. And it's actually extremely common for people to be practicing spirituality for decades, get really deep into Buddhism even, and still don't really have an idea of exactly what a view is. What constructs a self-view. It goes much deeper than beliefs. I think it's just some worldview or some conceptual lens that you're seeing the world through. Yeah, that's part of the view, but views go way deeper than that, right? It's how your mind aggregates through the five aggregates of form, feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness. It's basically your entire reality, and different views through various configurations of the aggregates manifest different geometries of your mind and reality. Right? And view creates this concavity of this dome that for most people it's completely invisible. Views can also operate at the preconceptual level. People tend to associate the state of having no thoughts with having no views. But if you substantiate the no mind state, then there's still a view there. Another reason why it's so important to refine your views is because views are consequential. They're not as innocent as some people think. Right? Views have real life implications and can lead to certain behaviors, patterns, or mental and emotional obscurations and afflictions. Wrong views can even lead to psychopathy and suicide ideations. Right? There are communities out there that reify emptiness, for example, make a thing or even personalities out of having this really bleak and nihilistic view of reality. And they would justify their states of depression with, oh, this is the insight into emptiness. Being depressed is okay, feel into it, but don't bypass and suppress. On the other side of that extreme is the, everything's about light and love kind of extreme view of oneness. And they fail to express or process quote-unquote negative emotions, and anytime they are in a state of oneness, they feel conflicted. In order to let the conditions untangle all on their own, the karmic knots to sort themselves out, you have to rest through with and as your emotional and cognitive obscurations and recognize their patterns. I think the oneness thing and the no self thing, that can all be extreme views, right? Well, ultimately, you want to go beyond the one, the many. But you can embody both. You can be the oneness. You can use the oneness lens if you want. But then you have to recognize that's how your mind is aggregating. You can do the self lens if the moment calls for it, sure. But then you see that there's the difference is that do you recognize that neither of these views has an inherent existence? Because like people mistaking the lack of inherent existence with non-existence. Just because something doesn't exist inherently doesn't mean that it ultimately doesn't exist, because non-existence is also an extreme view. So you can say this is the middle way path, but again, the middle way isn't really a point between two extremes, because once you see through the both sides of the extreme, the middle view also collapses. So the middle way is actually that which is transcending both sides of the duality, both sides of the extremes, while has the capacity to incorporate and embody both sides of the extreme. So I can say the oneness is not a wrong view, right? It's just a partial view. And same with like even like interconnectedness. I think I resonate a little bit more with the interconnectedness view, like dependent origination. You know, without this, there won't be that, right? If this arises, that arises. If this sees it, that sees it. So that's a really good, useful lens to see through a lot of extremes, right? So you don't actually have to annihilate the self or annihilate the subject. You see that the subject co-arising with the object. That's just the nature of phenomenons, how everything is codependent arising. You don't really actually have to get rid of the self. You see that the self codependent arise with the object, with the others, and you see how compounded phenomena and uncompounded phenomena both lack inherent existence, which is why which is precisely the reason why anything arises at all, right? The only reason why there is form, which is always interpenetrating. The only reason why there is form is because of relationships. And the only reason why there can be a relationship is because there's no size that has an inherent existence. Like me and you right now, we can't manifest each other this way, have a relationship, have a dialogue, unless we are both empty of inherent existence ourselves.
Frank, now there is something else that is emerging from Sri Lanka. Almost all of them are Buddhist. Now, when they go into some of these teachings like dependent origination and Satipatthana and Four Noble Truths and all that, there is another version coming up. It's a
Interesting.
moment to moment.
Moment to moment.
Moment to moment. Someone was giving this example that you have a projector. You are a filmmaker, so you will understand this.
Yeah. It's like one frame after another, one frame after another. Moment to moment to moment to moment to moment. Yeah.
Exactly. So everything is a projection and it's a moment to moment thing. Now, I'm sure you have something to say on that point, this moment to moment projection.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, again, it's not ultimately wrong to say that, but you have to transcend even that, right? Because the reason why you're experiencing a moment after another moment is because you're still compounding time. You're still compressing the timeless into moments by moments by moments. So there is still a sense of linearity, which is, again, it's not apart from this mandala, which transcends linear cause and effect and linear time. But the timeless includes all three times. So it's not like it's wrong to say there is moment to moment to moment. But once you get stuck in the moment to moment to moment to moment, then you're still fixated on a particular kind of view. Yeah, because you can still suffer when you experience yourself to be an impermanent self that transmute or transform moment to moment to moment to moment. Sure, you can have that insight and eradicate a lot of your suffering, but then it's not quite liberation yet. Impermanence is also the expedient insight, right? When people practice mindfulness, they're observing phenomena as rising and passing and rising and passing. First of all, there is a danger of making the observer into a thing, right? They could substantialize the present moment or the now also, right? They think that they're observing the present moment, but the quote-unquote present moment is also empty of inherent existence. So what they're observing is the fabrication or the root formation that time is real or time is linear. Same thing with the view that everything is a projection. So that's kind of like the view over how everything is mine, which again is not ultimately wrong, right? Everything is mine. But then you have to go even beyond that, because you realize that at first you think that there's a physical reality, and then you start doing spiritual practice and you start to realize, oh, everything is just mine, it's just a projection. And then you realize everything is mine. And then you see that there is no mine because this everything mineness is also empty of inherent existence. The danger of experiencing everything as mine is that you can fall into the view of solipsism or idealism. Yeah, just little traps that people just aren't aware of because nobody pointed out to them. Because it's so subtle, right? Like I wasn't aware of this myself when I was going through these phases. There is a danger in verifying that everything is mineness into some kind of a substantiality. That there's still a substrate that you can pin on and say, oh, this is the nature of reality. It's mine. And that nature of reality that we verify and substantialize could be everything is mine, or everything is consciousness, or everything is physical reality, everything is matter, or everything is impermanent, or even everything is empty. All those are very subtle views that you continuously refine and transcend. And then, of course, the ultimate view of no view, say the viewless view, can incorporate all these different extreme partial views. But you have to be able to recognize that to flexibly aggregate from one view to another. So you're not rejecting, annihilating, or negating anything. Language cannot really wrap itself around the ultimate truth, right? But I'm also saying that people just don't have the fitness or the lucidity to recognize how their reality is fabricated, how their view is constructed, from the ground up. And all of that takes practice, putting the reps. That's why I keep emphasizing on how realization fitness is realer than real. Physical fitness and how that's inseparable from like realization fitness and everything. But the more karmas that you exhaust or untwist, the more that you enhance your mental and physical capacities, your strength and everything. And I'm like lifting with way better form. Yeah, it's got stronger. Yeah. Well, I was gonna say the fitness thing is also because like you learn how to exert, like how to exert and push through suffering, just to be able to like exhaust your karma and to flip the karmas of like 8 billion people, because you are going against the karmic patterns of 8 billion people. In a sense, well, we don't have, in a sense, right? That takes a lot of power and exertion, and in order to like self-arise, that takes a lot of power. How many reps are you doing for the test?
10.
10. Okay, part of the requirement for joining contemplative CrossFit is
No,
bench
that's
press.
not the.
Well, this is your PITH instruction.
Yeah, that's my fifth instruction.
Yeah, because
From
she's leading the next.
5 rep max to
She's
10
gonna
rep
lead
max.
a parallel cohort, taking a lot of afflictions. So you have to increase the bench, and this is Tyson's training, been preparing her for the bench press. I've been talking about how running really helps too. It helps endurance at work also helps to like really teach you how to like exert and then have the patience to like just stay with the exertion. And not react, right? Not react. Because if you're running, if you're like reacting, if you have a lot of mental proliferation, that's just creating extra resistance, and then it's gonna slow you down. But same with the spiritual path, right? All this like extra beliefs is going to slow you down, because all the beliefs that you have in your mind that aren't true or aren't serving you will take energy from you. You feed those beliefs energy. Conditioning slow you down. So it's like shredding fat. And all the like, explosive and the speed training that I did with Plyometrics also helped, because you need to reach a certain escape velocity to leap into Buddha nature, because true nature is beyond speed, beyond coming and going, where the self-invalidation process is instantaneous.
You said the time factor, because
The time
every
factor.
time you bring in the time, you are making a linear, and you look at yourself. Then you go before the mirror after 5 years or this thing, you definitely know you have changed. Can you explain that?
Well, you got to go beyond even the duality between change and changeless. Stillness and movement, codependent and rise. Right? Neither has inherent existence. One of the first things that Nagarjuna expounded on in regards to emptiness is actually movement, right, and change. The moment you believe that there is a movement, you already believe in an essence that changes. But neither can you say there is no movement either, because that's the other side of the extreme. So with that said, I don't think you should negate time, because timelessness transcends, but it includes all three times. Going back to the non-dual view, right? A lot of radical non-dualists, they will just negate time altogether. Say, oh, there's no time, there's no becoming. They don't talk about karmas, because karma cannot exist, at least the trajectory of karmas, the way you're conditioned to become, cannot exist without time. It is time. So if you negate that and just bypass it, you can really negate a big part of your development in terms of like how exactly our moments forms, how exactly our karmas form. Right, that's something that you can actually understand non-conceptually, experientially. That's why I see a lot of non-dual people. They might be abiding in spaciousness or like awareness, whatever you want to call it, but then they still complain about how there's still very subtle conditionings and traumas and shadows that just always seem to be there, regardless of how much I sit and just let the things come up, right? Because they're not understanding at the subtle level karmic trajectories and conditioned becomings, and exactly how phenomena compound, which then creates a volition, what the Buddhists call volitional formations. It's the second link of the dependent origination process. And they just cut off that particular aspect of the development. Because I think Shi Yang said it really nicely. He said enlightenment is a multifaceted jewel. It's not just like one insight. Sure, you can say there's just one realization, but that realization can be looked at in so many different angles, and you can look at it from this way, you can look at the jewel from that way, you can continuously develop this way or that way. The moment you just cut off
And
time, yeah,
now,
you stop trying to understand karmas, and then that's why you still complain about how you still getting triggered by the same thing that's been triggering you since like 10 years ago, even though you have this access to like this, vast, infinite, boundless awareness. If I do this 360 thing, it's gonna be Charlie tripping.
How are you feeling about duty? Because I know that it's a journey for you, right? You come from like
Yeah, yeah.
superstar, celebrity, do whatever the fuck you want, and now you're like,
No,
professional.
yeah, I think I really like it actually. I'm enjoying being like somebody that works at a real job, even though this is not like a normal job, but it is a legitimate like job, right? The beauty of even routine, right? Defining freedom in structure. Doing whatever the fuck you want to do isn't freedom. It's finding the freedom even in restraint. That's what true liberation is. Order and chaos, they codependent rights, right? That's why used to be obsessed with prisons. When I watched Shawshank Redemption, I wanted to turn my room into prison cells. We talked about the joy of 9 to 5. That's why if you flip this karma, you look at people that complain about having a 9 to 5, and you're like, oh, you're missing out, bro. You get a steady salary and you get benefits. What more do you want? Okay, Monday to Friday, I try to be the most professional as I can be, even though there's still a lot of work to do. It's a work in progress. But like when it comes under the weekends, it's just that much sweeter. There's no distinction between work and life and play, right? But then on some level, there's still a distinction, which is the beauty of it too, because they're like now like the weekends are so much more fun, right? But like I said, for CC we need to do like Saturday review, so I still can't like fuck around on Friday nights. Yeah, it wasn't always a breeze in the park, for me to fully commit to my duty and being professional. It really felt like going to a job that I didn't particularly enjoy, and your performance is being measured by your coworkers, who are other realized beings. That's because I had lacked the fitness, but recently, with enough training, I set an intention to just enjoy the fuck out of it. I remember the first couple of boot camps where I was tasked to host sessions every day, not just from 7 to 9:30 a.m., but also 7 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. I was like, you mean I can't go on dates 6 days out of the week? It's the longest phase that I went through where I didn't have a female companion since I was 18 years old. So I was alone for a whole year. After meeting our head coach, it was suggested that I renounce from women and go into solitude to untangle my karmas of 1,000 heartbreaks. And on top of that, I was learning how to take on responsibilities. And as a reward, I get a salary every month, just like the normies. Thinking making money is bad because there's still a distinction between the spiritual and the material. Making money can be a dharma to find ethical, skillful, and compassionate ways to relate to the samsaric existence and to purify conditions through the conditionings. Money is imagined just like everything else, but the process of making money is a type of transmission, a creative energy exchange. And the client invests his energy during the work to acquire the money he pays me with, which is determined by what he thinks my value is and how much energy I can generate. He then stores that energy in a physical or non-physical form, which we call money, and if the client is satisfied with the product or service, co-creation happens. You can continue to enhance this energy exchange by investing wisely through non-grasping and follow nature's course of the least resistance. So my new work schedule in the last year really repatterned some of my conditionings. The conditioning of just doing whatever the fuck you want to do anytime that you want to do it. Now I enjoy it, but this was the ways that I pushed through the edge of my marginal fitness level. You know how when you're on psychedelics, you find every little thing interesting and fascinating, where you can actually train yourself to perceive that 24/7 sober. Okay, we're gonna work. To see work as play and play as work is a matter of fitness. I think I enjoy taking a responsibility now because I'm not identified with my profession. Before, I was identified with not wanting to take on responsibility because I was identified with something else that I believe is more worthwhile. But the split between what is business and what is play collapsed. Without the verification of time, there is no fear of missing out. Monks who renounce from the world, they're still within the convention of a monastic life. Turning away from the world presupposes that there is a world. Samsara and nirvana are not two. When renunciation serves its purpose, you close the causal loop by renouncing from renunciation.
You're like so excited actually. You're like running around. You're like, can I make you some egg whites? Do you want some water? Do you want some coffee? Here's some coffee, here's some coffee, here's some coffee.
Like the first day?
No, the first time I came into your house.
But that's what most adult humans do, right? Yeah, you work hard and train hard during the week, and then like on weekends you peak and you play hard, right? But if you look at like life and mind training or on and off the cushion training to be inseparable, it's an invisible monastery 24/7, right? There is no sila or rules in our boot camp, for example. But that's what makes it difficult, because what most people don't realize is that liberation comes with great responsibility, right? Now you have the freedom to make good and bad decisions. You're eating the karmas in the deepest shadows of sentient beings. So there's a lot of responsibilities because we're playing with fire. Our words and actions are consequential. During the week, you aggregate a certain way, create a professional bardo, for example, right? And then on weekends, you consciously, with intent, create another bardo. Right? The two bardos are neither the same nor different. Like in Arizona, the time difference is like I have to wake up at 3:45 a.m. to get ready for the boot camp. And I love telling people, I can't have another drink because I gotta go to work the next morning. Never had to say that before. I have to host a meditation boot camp. Like, what the fuck is that?
So we gotta get back to work. You got my back. I love you. Make me wet. Make me wet. Rock me wet. Make me wet. Shut.
The only time that I'm off on weekdays is 30 minutes of lunch and 30 minutes of dinner. The amount of work that we put into contemplative CrossFit is probably exceeds that of 9 to 5, actually. Wake up in 7 a.m. Eastern time, and then we have an hour and a half meditation, an hour of discussion. And then at 7 p.m. again, we do another round for people in different time zones. And in between that, there are readings to catch up, endless meetings. Not to mention, I'm still editing like 3 to 5 hours a day, constantly filming, playing the violin again, at least an hour a day. Working out, doing one-on-one calls, reading Acrolite's training logs, and replying to messages. Not to mention, you got to maintain Buddha nature throughout the day. And that's work, but that's just part of the package of the contemplative lifestyle, completion culture, CC. And I still have physical fitness clients to take care of. All these exertions is just part of the training. Another part of my training is relational skills. Not just working with other acolytes in the cohort and meet sentient beings where they are, but working with other team members in a professional manner. Beings who are highly realized. Even though I'm the co-founder of our organization, I'm always ready to be Steve Jobs. Nobody's safe. We're constantly self-invalidating ourselves. When one of your mentors is a Buddha who can engineer transmissions beyond space and time and read your karmas, how do you relate with a being like that, right? That's also part of the fitness. Our head coach said I only have one move, which is the infinite move, and I must go beyond infinity to relate to sentient beings. How do you decipher meditation maneuvers, routings made by other practitioners that they themselves are not even aware of? Which specific genres are they describing? Which bhumi are you working from? And point out the views that they're fixated on with skills and precisions that is in the same degree as playing the violin. How do you yoke into other people and feel their feelings and think their thoughts, not just as me feeling them, but as them feeling themselves, both and neither. And that's the 9th bhumi territory, where my training is at right now. And it takes yogic skills and capacities that are previously just inconceivable. I've been saying that anatta is not the end, but the beginning. From my coach's perspective, the Buddhahood is only the beginning too. Now we just go get a job to benefit all sentient beings. People think that chop wood, carry water means that you gotta retreat to the mountains. But in the context of modernity, it means going to work every day.
Level of precision that there's these lineages that they hold, we just don't know about.
All the people are seeking a way out of suffering. And
Yep.
that is the bottom line. How do they begin this exercise?
It all depends, right? That's why I think the reason why most people aren't making progress in the modern world is because they just jump from teaching to teaching to teaching. They don't stick with a specific path or specific practice until it starts working. So they'll just jump from this teacher to that teacher because the internet is so vast, right? You can easily just okay, this is this way, that way. This teacher says that teacher has this view, that view. I think the modern Dharma community has a pedagogy problem. So they're not getting to the root of it, how the nature of phenomena is fundamentally. They're still looking at the things at the very surface level in terms of like techniques, methods. If I do this, I should get that. Oh, if Frank says if you do Vipassana, then I should do Vipassana. Therefore, I will get whatever Frank is experiencing. But those are all conditioned. Yeah, you want to be able to look deeper than that and see how each practice applies to your own particular disposition or talent. Or like, what is your training history like? It's different for everyone. And then you get to decide what path you want to follow, or if you want to follow the pathless path, sure. Like, what makes a path pathless? What is the distinction and the relationship between the gradual path and the sudden path? Can they exist simultaneously? Can you recognize the non-separation between the relative and the ultimate, the two truths? You know, those are the things that people don't inquire into. You have to really examine the ontological structure around these practices. Otherwise, you're just going to be spinning in circles. And that also ties back in what I was saying about the view, right? You're still operating this from the self view, in a sense. You're not investigating the container that holds up your entire spiritual pursuit. And if you see through that, then if you recognize the meaning making, the sense making, and the ontological structure, the view that holds up your way of being, which then dictates how you want to practice, if you like this kind of practice or that, then it gives you a more freedom to pick and choose whatever spiritual practice that is most beneficial to you right now in this moment, because it changes, right? There's no like fastest way to enlightenment. There's no particular method that ultimately would work for you. Maybe there can be in this particular phase of your journey, but then what you want to do is continuously self-invalidate whatever progress that you're making, whatever you think is the best method right now. Sure, you can make some progress, but then you have to eventually let go of both the stains and the detergent. Because from the perspective of a clean shirt, both the stain and the detergent are obscurations. So it's a continuous ongoing process of self-invalidation to reveal the nature of mind, which is a non-affirmative negation. It's not a particular thing that you can even obtain.
Is that which is always and already the case, right? You just have so much obscurations and afflictions that get in the way. People say things like, I have conditionings, but you are the afflictions. But that affliction, just like the separate self, is adventitious, meaning that it's not ultimately real. It's like a holographic projection, but appearances can have consequences. Again, the two truths.
You're such a good boy, Charlie.
The spiritual journey can be boiled down to the continuous process of self-invalidation. So you can have this method that works here and there, but ultimately they all have to be self-invalidated. You have to question the intention and the purpose of each practice. What's the relationship between content and context? And then self-invalidate that whole container, and then move on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Even after a very deep realization, the exploration will continue. You can still explore many different methods, but then now you just have a more clarity of exactly what you're doing. Yeah, whatever progress you made, if you don't see through that, how that the samsara is continuously reinforcing samsara, then even the progress you made is just more conditionings. But then it's not like you're trying to dissolve all the conditionings too, because you can never out-dissolve or outpace reality, right? This conditioning getting generated, getting dissolved all the time. That's the nature of compounded phenomenons, right? It rises to cease. It rises to cease. Everything expand, contract simultaneously. The nature of compounded phenomena is that it compounds and decompound, compound and decompound. But then there is the unconditioned, which is beyond that. But then at the same time, you're the only way to recognize or realize the unconditioned is through with and as the conditions. That's where you have to, in our group, we say pay homage to your afflictions. You're not trying to get rid of anything. You're actually working through with and as your obscurations and your afflictions. And it is through your conditioning can you recognize the unconditioned. So you're not pushing anything away. You're actually just resting within your afflictions. And then do the recognition from that resting point, which is not the same thing as peace, by the way, or equanimity. When I say resting, is the fitness to be with whatever is arising. So you can actually rest as restlessness. You're not trying to generate any particular kind of state at all. You're not trying to generate a state of peace or equanimity, nor are you trying to generate some kind of a bliss, mystical states. At the same time, you're not avoiding or pushing away the darkness, the dark night of the soul and things like that. Dark night of the soul or even bliss, they are byproducts of realization, right? They're states, right? Experiences that are transient. I find that people can really confuse experience with insight, and they confuse insights with realization. So one of the biggest traps in people's journey is that they're chasing after states. Yeah, they don't commit. They do this practice in order to obtain some kind of ultimate state. How that view of, I must be within this God of mine or this mystical bliss or whatever. Why is the sense of self being, imputed upon that? Why am I craving towards some kind of ultimate state? How does that phenomena, that sense of compounding, generated? So we have to see the mechanism of that. So it's not about this or that state or this or that teacher or this or that teaching. They're just, like I said in the beginning, they're just expedient means for you to use as a temporary ground or an anchor for you to do the recognition from. They're just tools. But ultimately, if you don't see the nature of compounding phenomena through the nature of mind, then you're missing the point, right? Because otherwise, you're just going to be continuously removing obscurations with more obscurations. You're trying to clean up stains with more stains, which is never going to work because that's just the nature of phenomenon, nature of samsara, or a boro, right? It's like the snake eating its own tail. Like I said, I've tried out so many different practices, but then, people always ask, how do I know what practice and methods to use? This question is completely contextual and can only be answered when you have in mind the right view. And most views are socially constructed, right? So based on the conventions of the day. One of the modern conditioning is to copy and paste, like copying and pasting cookie cutter programs, the fastest way to get that sexy six-pack shortcut or the fastest way to realization. Fastest technology, enlightenment cap to get to the non-dual state and to access jhanas. And we have this tendency to think that if so-and-so did this program, I must be able to gain the same results. But programs and techniques are context and historically dependent. If you copy and paste like the Theravada techniques that were laid down by the Buddha thousands of years ago, when it was applied to the monastic life, to the modern world, there's going to be a mismatch, which is going to lead to all kind of problem because we come from such different views and lifestyles. If you try to copy and paste exactly what Ronnie Coleman does at the gym and apply it to yourself, it's probably not going to end up well. You might get injured. So I think instead of thinking techniques, which can seem categorically distinct, and again, context dependent, which can lead to a reification of like, this technique is just its own thing and is better or worse than this other technique. It's more useful to think in maneuvers, right? The difference between techniques is simply difference in maneuvers. And maneuvers and routings, right? Different maneuvers leads to different routings and vice versa, right? So for example, in the Vipassana retreat, they simply teach you one maneuver, scan your body from head to toe. Two maneuvers if you count scanning the body from toe to the head, right? The difference between, say, do nothing meditation and Vipassana is simply the difference in how you maneuver yogically. Someone asked me today, what is the best way to release tensions in the head? So I listed a bunch of maneuvers. One is do nothing meditation, dropping the ball. Another is like Vipassana. And another is TWIM, applying metta. TWIM is actually a maneuver that has 6 maneuvers within the maneuver, right? Recognize, release, relax, resmile, return, repeat, the 6 R. Sending in love. Or like, again, using the breath to breathe into the contractions in your head and then slowly bring it down to the heart center. That's a maneuver. So when I ask people, what did you do in your meditation today? They're like, you use my breath. What kind of maneuver are you making with the breath? And do you have the precision to describe your maneuvers? Or at least, keep a mental note of it. So maybe you can try it again the next time. In a 1 hour sit, you probably make like 30 to 50 maneuvers, right? You just don't know it. Does this particular maneuver lead to this or that routing, which might end up with a different destination than that maneuver, right? Depending on your specific intention. Does it work? If it doesn't, find another maneuver. Problem solve. Troubleshoot. People don't even think about these nuances in their contemplative practices. Just like when you practice the violin, right? There's infinite combination of fingerings and bowings that you can apply, or a difference in shifting in position. You can actually play the same passage with completely different sets of fingerings and bowings. How does that affect the emotional tone of the passage, or the story that it's trying to tell, and the overall structure of the entire piece? The same thing could be applied to fitness or playing or building a video game, or making art, filmmaking, or creating your life. And what you do in the cushion is inseparable from what's going on in life, right? Because life training is mind training. So if you look at both your meditation sits and your life as an obstacle course, if you maneuver through the obstacles in meditation, you also maneuver through the obstacles of life. Another example is macros, right? You have a very specific set of macros that you want to target, you want to hit. There are infinite varieties of food that you can eat in order to hit this particular ratio of protein, carbs, and fat. If you have the goal of like hitting 600-pound squat, the same thing applies. People don't usually think meditation could be measured. We don't have a problem with measuring our fitness levels.
For some reason, people think realization fitness is different. In our CC bootcamp, after every sit, we launch polls with specific questions about how the sit went. If you look at the screen, that's one of the examples of our poll. And what kind of insights they've gained and so on. And along with their training logs and one-on-one calls, the mentors carefully track each athlete around the clock. We have the technology to collect all kinds of data, right? HRV, sleep matrix, recovery scores, PRs on every lift, macros, all kinds of numbers. And it can help, right? It can give you a sense of where you're at. Maybe it can help you pinpoint where you're going, when you're pushing too hard, when you're not pushing hard enough. But at the end of the day, it's just a representation. It's not the thing in itself, right? It's not your actual state. It's a reflection. It's a snapshot filtered through whatever tools that we're using. It's helpful, but we gotta remember, data is an experience, right? It's just pointing towards it. It's a representation, it's a model. But it's useful to have models and maps sometimes. It's a symbolic way of trying to make sense of something that's much more subtle. So this whole thing about realization fitness is something deeper, right? Something that applies not only to how far of how fast we can run, but how we live, how we relate to others, how we respond to pressures, to life. Because those data points, again, they're just proxies. So real fitness only shows itself under real conditions, when you're out there on race day and everything's on the line. And I think life has its own kind of a race day too. Crisis or, transitions, conflicts, or meeting a guru. That's when you find out what you're actually made of, where your mind training gets tested in life. Can you hold the tensions without collapsing? Can you still function, still cook, still show up, even when everything inside you wants to quit? That's your fitness test. And it's not a formal thing, it just happens. Life will throw curveballs at you, and you just have to see if you can meet it. From a spiritual lens, especially past like Vajrayana, this goes even deeper, right? It's not just about keeping it together at hard times. It's about recognizing the sacred within those moments. To relate with the guru is a fitness test in and of itself, right? It's not about forced belief. It's about discovery, realization. And then your test becomes, can I stay lucid? Can you remember what's true? Not just when things are peaceful, but all the time. That's the devotional path, right? A real teacher will trigger the fuck out of you, hold up a mirror for you, right? But all this, physical, emotional, spiritual, it takes sensitivity, right? It's not just about grinding all the time. It's about knowing when to push, when to pull back, right? Physical training, right? Some days you're off, and then if you're smart, you don't force it. You adjust. Sometimes you have a cheat day to shock the system. Go out on Friday once a week. You meditate like 3 to 5 hours a day. And you learn to keep pushing and keep working through your marginal fitness gains by working at the edge. You progressively overload. You plan your overreaching phase without overtraining. You pace, you taper, you deload, and go on another cycle and another cycle. Iterate from one phase to another. Those tools can help, sure, like HVR, data matrix, but ultimately it comes down to rest and recognition, presence, knowing exactly what the fuck is happening right now. And another trap is to prove to ourselves that we've arrived, that we're fit, that we're realized. We latch onto these external benchmarks, like, oh, if I can do this workout, then I'm ready. Or if I meditate this many hours, then I'm gonna get that. If I meditate for that many hours, I'm gonna be enlightened. But that's not it. Real fitness, whether it's in your body, your mind, or in life, right, shows up in how you live and how you meet the unfolding moment. It's about how you adapt. It's about clarity and patience. It's not about perfection. It's about how flexible you are as a cosmic octopus. It's about relating and claiming every aspect of yourself. Just bring all your conditionings that you accumulated throughout your whole lifetime or just today into the sit. And those conditionings will affect your routings and maneuvers, and vice versa. Just like in fitness, if you didn't get enough sleep the night before, and that condition is to be taken into account in terms of the variation of maneuvers and routings. And what maneuver did you make to experience this or that state, or receive this or that insight? So what is the maneuver of resting and recognizing that I've been talking about? It's the ultimate maneuver of no maneuver, which is still a maneuver. It's the maneuver of practicing enlightenment, seeing the fruit as the path and vice versa. Seeing Buddha nature all the time after it's been pointed out to you. Resting as being equivalent to a max effort set in the gym. The resting is really the fitness to be with whatever's arising. Right before Buddha's enlightenment, under the tree, he had to rest through with as the powerful afflictions of Maya and the temptations from the hell realm. So right after he had to renounce from his renunciation by ending the ecstaticism phase, where he literally starved himself to death almost, and he realizes that to be completely powerful, all powerful, you have to be completely weak. And recognition is the lucidity in which you can recognize the patterns of your formation, the patterns of what makes you you. the patterns of your condition, the patterns of compounded phenomenon. When you're totally at rest, and when resting and recognizing becomes a singularity, and you sustain that, it's also total openness. Contact, fully contacting itself. The sheer fact of presence, knowing itself. Even that word grasping is problematic, right? Even letting go. Like, what does it mean to say you're letting go of something? People don't question that, right? They're just like, oh, this teacher said you have to let go and do nothing. Okay, I'm gonna let go. But what is the mechanism of letting go? Yeah. What is the mechanism of grasping? Because if you don't have the right view, letting go is just a temporary relief, right? It's not gonna solve your core issues. But if you do have the right view, letting go happens spontaneously.
This was my question. So eventually, if someone to say, oh, my search is over, it's questionable because you don't know from which position you are saying it.
Exactly. Good point. Yeah. It's ultimately it's about your relationship to these things, right? What is your relationship with grasping? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like you said, they're not seeing the position in which they're taking when they say, oh, I'm letting go. Well, again, going back to examine your view, right? If you constantly trying to expand or let go of something, then you can be trapped in the view of eternalism. You continuously want to enter the God realm or the Godhead. And on the other side of that, you have the view of annihilation or nihilism. But they're actually two sides of the same coin, right? They're the two poles of the same self-view, actually. The only reason why you want to let go or expand is because you're trying to avoid something, or it presupposes some kind of a contraction that you're trying to let go of, for example. But then again, contraction is not the problem. Or if you're trying to annihilate the self, there's a lot of people who practice Vipassana, they'll have this mindset of, oh, I have to dissolve every last speck of the self, or I have to exhaust all my conditionings. But then they're just generating another knot to untie this knot over here. So whatever is trying to get rid of the self is just more self. There's more selfing. But again, the selfing is not the problem, right? It's your relationship to them and whether or not you can see how your views are generated, through, say, the 5 aggregates of like form, feeling, perception, fabrication, consciousness. Where aggregates are empty too, right? It's just a model. It's not like a fundamental architecture of reality. Aggregates must be self-invalidated too.
So let me ask you this. Back to this question of the doer. The non-duals usually say doer has no role. What is happening is happening. Do you subscribe to that or?
Yeah, that's another one, right? Yeah, I like it with the word posture, right? Because when we talk about views, we're not just talking about concepts or intellectual views or worldview. We're talking about the entirety of your experience. How you might aggregate, which is the entire reality, right? So we're talking about like this concavity that we call reality that we don't even see, this invisible dome. So posture is a really good way to describe it. People who reify their non-dual view, sometimes they just use it to bypass, to stay lazy, to not take responsibility for life. Non-dualship is a conditioned state that cannot stand on its own 2 feet. Right? When the right cause and condition is come together, there's the feeling of non-doership. When another set of cause and condition arise, there's a feeling of doer. I think another trap on the path is that people tend to verify or make substantial the process of phenomena's decompounding. Because we're so contracted all the time, sure, a temporary relief of phenomena's decompounding feels great. But the insight is seen through the lack of inherent existence, both the compounded and the uncompounded phenomenons. When people verify the state of decompounding and not seeing the full pictures of how everything is constantly contracting and expanding, how on the eccentric and the concentric part of the lift, they codependent rise and they need each other to manifest. So if you don't have the wisdom into the nature of phenomenons, then we can end up, say, we just want to take psychedelics all the time to feel spacious. Because what happens when you take psychedelics is phenomenons just start to decompound. You deaggregate, so to speak. But once you hang on to that state as being the ultimate, you're compounding it again. Or people can try to abide in the state of non-doership. Right? Once you pin a state to be more preferable than another, then you're by default rejecting another aspect of experience. The non-doership is a position in which you can utilize as a remedy to cure the quote-unquote disease of overly doing. Or like if you have too strong sense of a doer, or if you're constantly trying to control reality, then you can use the non-doership posture or position to see through that. But then ultimately, again, you have to go beyond extremes. You have to go beyond even the extreme of doership versus non-doership. Yeah. So you can actually will without agency.
and think without thoughts and desire without craving. Because again, desire is not the problem, right? It's your relationship to it, whether or not you're reacting to it with I like this, I don't like this, or neutral. That's what's creating the craving and the grasping, and then the becoming, the habitual tendencies, right? The desire is just the force of life. Again, thoughts is not the problem; it's the grasping around thoughts, or the mistakenness of thoughts to have inherent existence. Same thing with doership and non-doership. None of these are problems.
You said something which is very unique. Desire is not a problem, but the craving is.
Yeah.
I mean, that's if you differentiate these two, then you are neither committing anything, nor are you, because the
Exactly.
craving.
Neither nor, yeah. You neither want to dissociate, nor do you want to grasp. You just let the desire express itself without desiring on top of desiring, either to like get rid of it or to cling on to it. Without desire, there won't be nature, right? Nature, human, yeah. Yeah. The only reason why this moment exists at all is because of desire. You can say that's the desire of the universe, or desire with a capital D. It is the force of nature. The only reason why we're breathing, why we enjoy food, sure, it's not the problem to enjoy food, right? It's the identity you create around it. Do you recognize your pattern of identities and your conditioned becoming? Sure, there is no agent in the mind, sure, but there's still a will. You can say that will is also connected to the desire. There is a will of the universe, right? That's the only reason why something appears is because that there is some kind of a will. Like you can visualize it in a sense that imagine if you take the entire universe and then you take a time lapse out of it. Maybe you film it and then you condense it into a work of art, like a time lapse, and put it in a museum. A sense of becoming. It's beautiful, right? Yeah. And with that comes, desire and reproductive energy, the creative force of nature. That you're not trying to negate that. It's the resistance to that, the craving around that's creating the suffering. That's why I think the Buddha distinguishes between first and second dart, right? The first dart is inevitable, right? It's just the raw sensations of life. It's the second dart that we throw on top of the first dart, the reaction, the craving, identities, and stories, the meaning making, that is the source of suffering. So pain and pleasure are all welcome and inevitable, but suffering is optional. That's like Buddha's 101. Yeah. Same thing with the sense of like will, right? You can actually have an intention and have a will without condensing it to an individual agent that's controlling everything.
Frank, would you mind repeating that first thought and the second thought? That's a very important thing for my audience.
The first thought is just the raw contact, the raw sensations of life, right? I'm not sure if your audience is familiar with the 12 links of dependent origination. Yeah. So they mastered that. Okay. So you can break it down through that model and say that the first thought is just the raw contact, right? The contact is the fifth link. There's constantly contact, right? You're constantly in contact with reality. Like the sensation, the raw feeling of the quality of sensations, the quality of sensations, the texture of sensations. It's constantly going on. That's the only reason why there is an experience, is because of the constant contact. I don't even want to say with reality, because there's no distinction there. There's no like a gap there. Everything's gapless. So it's almost like contact is contacting itself. So that contact, the raw contact, is the first dart. But then once that started to proliferate and started to compound, the second dart is then thrown on top of the first dart. The reason why they're suffering is not because of the contact in the first dart, is because of the reactions.
Yeah, it's
Vedana. That's where the selfing process begins. Yeah. The selfing process is a kind of a loop back on itself, right? It's almost like you're creating this, like same thing with the observer, right? The observer is almost like the second dart. Yeah, one of the insight into the nature of phenomena is that there is no separate observer, right? So the observer is almost like that second dart. So the second dart can be manifested and interpreted in many different ways, not just the stories of meaning making, but even the sense of a separate observer is something like the second dart, which is something that, which is the start of is the selfing, is where the selfing process begins. Is that looking back, and then that's creating the split in consciousness into like subject, object, observer, the observed. That self-referential loop that's creating a duality between the apprehender and the apprehended.
But that is a very tricky thing. If the second thought is the observer, then it's a huge trap, because
because everything you do from that point, from the split, is still split, right? It's just continuously compound. So if your consciousness is already split, then you can, like, say, practice vipassana or self-inquiry. It's still, you just continuously doing the compounding and splitting and reinforcing that split over and over. Yeah. So how do you get out of that,
Yeah,
right? That's $1 million question. How do you get out of that? If you have the right view and the right recognition, you turn the Ouroboros orientation from ignorance to wisdom. The first link of the dependent origin process is what ignorance, right? It's that ignorance that cascades to the whole mess of suffering. But then if you can flip that ignorance to wisdom, then the cycle of samsara turns on its own head into nirvana. Sure, I think the most important thing is recognition. It's the splitting is not really the problem. The compounding is not the problem, because life wouldn't be here without compounding, right? All this twisting is the reason why we reincarnate, right? The lines of the trees, the rings on the tree, is a manifestation of karmic compounding, the karmic trajectory, right? The muscles, right? If you don't twist, there's no muscles. Tendons, bones, the way that tendons wrap around the bones. The beauty of existence is all twists. It's just like Ellen Watts said, there's no straight lines in the universe. There's only wiggly no things. Phenomena twist in and twist out. That's life, right? In fact, to incarnate is to twist in. We package sentience into our meat suit, into our nervous system. Without this twisting, there is no life. Because of this twisting, we become finite beings. But the paradox, which is not really a paradox, it is only through the finite that the infinite knows itself, right? So form and emptiness are also inseparable. It's the twisting on top of the twisting, the compounding on top of the compounding, the resistance on top of whatever is already happening that's creating the suffering. The initial step is really just to recognize it. We don't even have to talk about like dissolving things or like letting go, because like we said earlier, all that can still, in a very subtle level, creates its own resistance and contractions and reinforcing some kind of a view. Yeah, so just to rest and recognize exactly what is going on is, I think, can just take you all the way. But again, the depth of your rest and the depth of your recognition is what distinguishes between somebody who is only practicing this path for like a month versus like an arahat, or even beyond that, like a Buddha.
Great. Actually, Frank, I don't want to ask any more questions. The reason is now you brought it to a particular point where the audience can...
There's some kind of resolution.
Yeah, there is a way out.
Yeah, there is a way out.
There is a way out. So I mean, we are going to talk again. I'm going to invite you further.
Thank you. I just want to make one last point, right? If you think you're done with the path, you're delusional. If you think you're not done, you're also delusional.